you all so much for coming this evening. Really appreciate you making some time for this project. And we know that it's an exciting time to start talking about it, but we also know that it's a commitment to come out to an evening event, so we appreciate that very much. My name is Kathy Kogan. I'm the project manager from CHA Architecture. I was hired by the district to work with you on this project. This is Alan Cunningham. He's the Director of Design at CHA Architecture. And I'll have Roberta give a little intro if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Alan. Thank you all for being here this evening. I'm Roberta, Superintendent of Schools at MSAD 49, and I'm just going to take a minute, again, to welcome you to one of our numerous community forums. This will be the third one that we're hosting. We have 3 more to go. We decided, based on some feedback we received and some conversation in our building committee, that we would host events in each of the community schools, with the exception of what would have been for Fairfield Primary School. In Fairfield, we're going to host that one at Lawrence Junior High in the gymnasium. We're also going to host a virtual forum for anyone who might not be able to get into one of the buildings or may not feel comfortable participating in person for whatever reason. So before we get into this presentation here, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of how we came to arrive at this moment here. And it is a long process in the timing of doing a study and getting in the queue when the Department of Ed opens these applications up can take many, many years. So this project was born out of the school board in 2012 wanting to address some of our aging buildings in the school district. The Benton is the shiny new one in the elementary school realm. It is about 30 years old. This, I think, was part of the original space, as I understood, with classrooms all around here, has been explained to me over the years. Yep. And this was actually a renovation project. So little space here, the renovation was all that we know and see of Benton. It's quite a sizable structure. And at its height, there were nearly 1,000 students here in this space, and I expect it was very crowded at that time because I don't think the building was designed in the classroom spaces that I've seen for that number of children in those spaces. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happens in school buildings now, what programs we serve. So that was, I think, in the late 80s. And things have changed and evolved as far as what schools are called upon to deliver for programming and services, expanded quite a bit. And some of the things that happen in schools and some of the methods that are used in instruction and some of the programming that we now provide have changed in the way of a need for real estate and some infrastructure. So 2012, the Facilities Committee began a study for looking at each of the buildings and the needs and the elements that might be in need of, say, replacement or upgrade, and looking at some of the costs of operating these buildings. And the intention was to ultimately put together some applications to the Department of Education, and 3 were filed in March of 2017 for actual potential replacement of these buildings. And there was a period of time that went by, about another year, before the Department of Ed took those applications and rank ordered them. So they're application cycles. It's not that the Department of Education opens up annually or every 5 years or 10 years. It's all dependent on maybe the economics and pardon, and bonding capacity. Okay. So rank order, 74 applications, and Fairfield Primary School ended up at #1 in the list of all those applications submitted. And Clinton ended up at number 39 and Albion at number 58. So a year later, I had received a call from the commissioner, it's Commissioner Macon right now, who took that list and was recommending to the State Board of Education that the department fund 3 projects, and his primary being First on the project. We were one, and a school in MSAD 54, based out of Skowhegan, was named, and a school in Rumford. So those are the only 3 out of the 74 that are in the queue right now for funding. However, what we're going to talk about tonight are some possibilities. So moving forward, we received that. I worked with the team at the Department of Education, Scott Brown, who was the director of major capital construction. And that began right after I had that conversation with Commissioner Macon. And we worked on what's next in this process. And the first thing that we needed to do was conduct a feasibility study where we assess all of our capacity in elementary. And we needed to hire a firm to do that and potentially carry us through to fruition of a building being raised up and students walking through the doors. So we had a selection committee work through, we received applications for the work on the feasibility study, and the group selected CHA. So you have Alan and Kathy here representing their firm, and they engaged in the feasibility study, which they presented to the school board this past December. And thus we began with our work, building committee, public forums, just to get the information out there as far as what they found in their study, and begin to talk about what are some of the options for our communities, for our district, and what are some of the possibilities, and what are the wishes and wants, needs of our school communities. So it's a very exciting time, and I would say, and I repeat it again and again, but it truly is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This was a renovation project. I can't, in my mind's eye, recall or have any record of this school district being in the queue for a major capital construction, a brand new building raised up for our community, and potentially, nearly 100% funded by the state. And I do know that one of the things that we did as a selection committee team is look at some of the projects that the various firms who applied to work with us have as examples. And we traveled around and we spoke with the personnel in each of those buildings and talked a lot about specifications and what the state will fund, and potentially meeting almost 100% of funding, which I think is an easier target to reach in an elementary project maybe than a secondary project, a high school project. So again, it's very exciting, and I'm happy that you're here, and the team is here to share some information and also hear from you. So we have dedicated, if you are not aware, an email that you'll see on our banner page if you haven't looked lately, for any questions related to construction, school construction project, where we are now, where we're going with it. And we also have a survey up here, and we have a tab on the main page where we're going to house information as we collect it from these events, among them are the recordings from them. And on that note, before I forget, I'm going to put this mic on that stand there, and I would ask if you do have a question or a comment that you want to make, that you step up to the mic here, so we can capture that as part of the audio recording. So, thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Okay, so what we want to do tonight is we wanted to talk to you a little bit about the opportunity from the state, and Roberta covered that. We want to share with you our findings from the work that we did looking at your existing buildings. We want to talk a little bit about concerns and issues associated with this project. and then a little bit about what the process looks like for the project, and also get your feedback. I think getting your feedback is one of the most important things that we'll do. So when we were hired by the district, we were asked, the Department of Education wants us to do our homework. So the first thing they always ask us to do is really kind of take a deep dive into the existing facilities of the district. So we were asked to look at capacity, space allocation, and utilization in all of your elementary buildings and your primary building. We were asked to look at the building systems, age and lifespan. We were asked to look at compliance with codes and regulations. Any expansion possibility, could any of the buildings be added onto on the existing sites? And then also look at the site analysis and the usage of the site, the traffic flow on the site, the playgrounds, etc. So we looked at Fairfield first. Fairfield was built in 1907 after the fire was rebuilt in 1927, and the annex was added in 1952. So it's quite an old building. It does not comply with barrier-free or accessibility requirements. It's, as you know, separated out on many levels. There's a number of stairs just to get into the building, and then stairs throughout the building. It does have a sprinkler system. However, because of its age, many of the current code requirements are not met. The other thing that is kind of interesting about this, or noticeable about this particular building, is that it's on a very small site. The site is only about 1.5 acres. So that means that there's virtually no room for site circulation. The building and the playground and the annex take up almost the entirety of the site with some parking. So site circulation happens in the street, which is not ideal for parent drop-offs.
It's also, you get that?
Yeah.
It's also for pre-K and K, 13 different levels within an old building is not necessarily a good situation. If we were doing that with mixed-age students, they wouldn't be allowed above the first floor. So there's, as Kathy pointed out, we went through all the reports on all the schools, all the previous work done, and we sort of brought all those together, did some on-site investigations. And, you know, it's not surprising in the case of Fairfield, for a building of 113 years old that's been rebuilt after a fire, it doesn't meet ADA. It doesn't even come close to meeting ADA. It doesn't have a mechanical ventilation system. And there's been workarounds. You know, you can see the old boiler that was there in place. You can see spaces, educational spaces in the basement that don't really have a good layout for the kids. And I think that was pretty much typical for all 4 of these schools. Because of when the ADA came along and became law, it was like 2009, and all these schools were built before then. So everybody's trying to do a little catch-up. So I need to just jump in and
That's okay. So let's look at Albion real quick. So Albion was built in 1952 and had an addition put on in 1980. There was a water treatment storage reservoir installed to deal with some water quality issues. It does not have a sprinkler system. Again, as Al mentioned, it does not comply with ADA. And all of the buildings in these Fairfield and Albion both have very old electrical and mechanical systems. So their infrastructure is, to be honest, the district has done a remarkable job at keeping those systems going by sort of patching things here and there and adding on when needed and replacing parts and components as needed. But as a whole, the system has outlived its lifespan. And as Al mentioned, with Fairfield, the same is true at Albion. It doesn't have any fresh air, so it's not having any air exchange in the building. And daylighting, it doesn't have ideal daylighting. It has, windows in some of the classrooms, but when we had the oil embargoes and major energy cuts in the 70s, your buildings experienced the same thing the buildings across the country did, where we took out windows and we closed them off to reduce energy loss or heat loss and reduce energy costs. So as a result, your daylighting in the building is compromised. And again, at Albion, the site circulation for the buses and the parent drop-off are combined. So that's not what current standards are for the state of Maine. They like to see those separated. It's safer for everybody involved, but especially for the kids crossing traffic lanes. So this slide shows the orange is the original building and the blue was the addition in 1980, 79, 80. So the next one is Benton, and as Roberta mentioned, Benton is your most current building, but the original building was built in the 1950s, and the additions were done in 1988, so as she said, about 30 years old. And as Al mentioned, those additions were done prior to ADA requirements, so accessibility requirements are not, they're better here, for sure, but they're still not quite perfect, right? There's no asbestos in the original building, which is great. That was all abated as part of the 1988 renovations and expansions. And site circulation is definitely better here, but it's still not ideal. And this is also a relatively small site as it stands right now. So site circulation is still probably congested pretty during the pickup and drop-off.
Right. It's 15 acres, and most of that is taken up. It's pretty well master planned, all the play fields out back. And like Kathy was saying, the bus drop-off loop, parent drop-off loop isn't ideal, but, and security, we talked about that a little bit. We now have a security vestibule right by the training feet. So, and the plan, as you look at the plan, it'd be very difficult to really add on or expand this kind of configuration. If one of those houses was not there, it would be easy to put another house there. You can envision that, but it'd be pretty hard to add on to it in this way.
Each of these houses, these furniture houses are these little blocks, the classroom blocks. They each have hipped roofs, so it's tricky to add on to a hip roof. But I will say that one of the things that's really lovely about this building is that it was very well thought out in terms of having shared spaces for the classrooms. It has a centralized organizing feature, the library, and it does have primarily a single point of entry for the entire building, which is a tradition, current standards for safety and access to the building. It has these little houses, which, like I said, with shared project spaces and between activity spaces, I think they're called. So and that's a really nice layout. The classroom sizes are smaller than what is allowed by state currently. They're about 600 square feet, and current state standards have classrooms, elementary school classrooms at about 800 square feet, and then pre-K and kindergarten classrooms that are about 1,000 square feet each. So they are a little on the small side, and if I understand correctly, they're also the highest student-to-teacher ratio in the district is here. So that's sort of an anachronism that we might look to try to balance out, as part of this project. So
being the newest building, the systems are really good, and with continued maintenance of this facility, it's going to go for a while. I was going to say, in addition to the classrooms being small, they have bathrooms, but none of the bathrooms meet the ADA or the sink. So that's sort of a common theme amongst all the schools.
So then for Clinton was built in 1940 and has had sort of a choo-choo train of additions in 49, 59, 63, and 74. So lots of additions added onto that building. Again, there's some site circulation issues here. It's also a congested site. It's a smaller site. And like Albion and Fairfield has some challenges with accessibility and meeting current code regulations. It does not have a sprinkler system, so any future additions to this building would require a full sprinkler system in the building. Mechanical systems, seem to be struggling to keep up with the classrooms. We see lots of space heaters in the classrooms to supplement the heat for the entire building. We also see fans mounted in individual classrooms. And again, many of the plumbing fixtures and electrical systems have outlived their lifespan. Site drainage seems to be a concern here. There's some ponding on the site that's concerning. And the metal siding that's on the existing, that you see on the building, is in good condition, but it was overlaid onto the original board and batten siding. So that's not an ideal configuration.
So, if I could jump in. Here again, ADA, no ventilation, no mechanical ventilation that really works, at least in today's code, and no sprinkler system. And you can see, yeah, there's just a tremendous amount of workarounds for indoor air quality, for technology, for wiring, for touch screens, monitors. You can see a whole history of technology in Clinton for the most part. And then a lot of the retrofits that came along in the lower left-hand corner here, trying to figure out how you're going to incorporate bathrooms into the existing plan that are small, that are raised up, they're not accessible, they're not in the right program, they may not be with kindergarten or pre-K, kindergarten. And then specifically on Clinton, underneath that stair is a music program, and there's no real way to have access to that. There's no elevator, there's no ramp. So it's really inaccessible.
So this shows like I said, all the various additions that were added. So the light blue here is actually the original building. And then in 49, the orange was added, 59, the light purple, 63, the dark purple, 74, the big red, and then in 89, the green box for the classroom. So lots of additions, and it's gotten to the point where the site is essentially maxed out for any additional additions. Also, as I mentioned before, the building, with current building codes, if the building were to receive an addition, a full sprinkler system would need to be put in the building. So the next thing we looked at was the cost of ownership for these buildings. So we looked at a couple different things. We looked at your utility costs for the buildings. We looked at the operations and maintenance costs for the buildings. And what you see here is for Albion. So what we look at in order to be able to compare apples to apples from one building to another, where one building might be using 2 boilers, one building might be using air handling units. You've got one on propane, you've got one on oil, whatever. So you've got all these different methodologies for heating and servicing your buildings. But what we look at is what's called energy use intensity, and it's basically the energy per square foot. So that allows us, we also looked at the cost of your energy based on whatever fuel source you're using. But that allows us to sort of compare something a little bit more parity, to have some parity across how we compare the buildings.
So we know that energy costs go up and down. Price of oil goes up and down, gas, kerosene, propane, diesel, you name it, goes up and down. But what we look at the end of the day is we take all those fuels and we convert it to kBTUs, which is a British thermal unit that each one of those units represents. So we have an accurate idea as to how much energy it's taking to support that school, that facility. And so that's what we call the energy use intensity, and it's kind of it's a benchmark, if you will, okay, that we look at for performance, because we're really interested in creating value and doing high-performance buildings. So you can see those numbers up there: Albion 99, Benton 89, Clinton 66, and Fairfield 53. Those numbers may not look so bad compared to new buildings down here, 35, 25, but all those buildings in that lower tier are new buildings. And they include ventilation. They include all the things that you get with a new building. So if you were to add the ventilation numbers to the EUI for the existing schools that you have right now, to do ventilation, it'd be that much higher. So what we do is we then take that with the amount of dollars, we collected all your utility costs, we average them over the last 2 years, and so we have a really good sense of where you're spending money on utilities.
And you can see just from a sort of empirical cost point of view, you're spending about $1.50 roughly per square foot for your buildings. It's less for Fairfield. Fairfield has a lot less infrastructure, and it's also a smaller footprint of the building. But a new school would be somewhere around 60 cents a square foot.
So we kind of bench. We also looked at the operational costs. We met with Scott, we collected all the operational costs, and we put them on a little table here as well. And from Albion at $3.73 a square foot to Fairfield $1.90, and Benton, the newest one, at $1.87. Typical new construction will be $1 per square foot or less. And folks always ask me, geez, what does that represent? And with a new school, it's all about our dialogue, okay? When you refinish these VCT floors, and they gotta come in here and buff them and strip them and wax them on a continual basis, if you look at the long-term cost of that, it's very expensive. There are other choices to bring down those costs that don't require as much maintenance. And so those are the kinds of discussions that we'll have about operational costs. But all in all, when you balance your utilities and your operational costs, we can do somewhere around $2 a square foot. And right now, if you look at your costs alone on just the operational side, $3.73 a square foot, these older buildings are really starting to take their toll. I was going to put a plug in for Kathy. Kathy just got through doing Mount Ararat High School, and it's probably our most high-performance public school in the state of Maine, with an EUI down around 25, and they decided to do a power purchase agreement for photovoltaics, 500 kW system, and so the net EUI is down around 11, which is really, really good.
So then we looked at what some of your other costs are going to be for the cost of ownership, essential repairs. So we're looking at the age of your heating systems, the condition of your electrical systems, the age of your roofs, that kind of thing. And we looked at Albion and Clinton in particular. For both of those buildings, we ran some numbers with our cost estimating team, and we estimate that Albion, you've got about $3 to $4 million worth of essential repairs coming for that building over the course of the next few years. It could be next week, like we experienced at the junior high school here, right, where all of a sudden there was a catastrophe in the middle of the building that needed to be addressed with the sewer line. Or it could be over the course of the next 10 years, these things that need to be replaced as things fail. We included sprinkler upgrades in those because that's sort of a significant life safety item. It's what the state would consider a priority 1 or a tier 1 repair, essential repair for that building. And then for Clinton, between $4 and $4.5 million for the same type of upgrade. These do not include ADA upgrades. ADA upgrades we estimate to be, so they're feasible, because in some cases they're not feasible, but like replacement of sinks to make the sinks accessible for handicapped students. Maybe adding some handrails. You know, we can't necessarily fix the fact that there's stairs that don't comply, or elevator to a music room, for example. That would be a much more significant cost. But minimal ADA upgrades to those buildings would be in the neighborhood of another $30,000 to $40,000.
I was going to say, these numbers do not include anything to the envelopes. Doesn't include window replacement, siding replacement, new roof insulation, new technology, new finishes. It's really just electrical, mechanical, and sprinkler upgrades that we see right around the corner.
So then the other thing that the Department of Education wants the district to look at, and the district has already done this, is get upgraded enrollment projections. So for your pre-K to 6, sorry, let me back up for a second, because those enrollment projections are done by a professional who does these kinds of things all the time. They look at all sorts of different data. They look at in-migration and out-migration trends. They look at birth rates. They look at known births in the district. They look at real estate trends in the district. They look at your tuition students, your non-tuition students, that kind of thing. So they look at a whole bunch of data. They look at historical data going back 5 years, and then they project out forward for 10. And what the state will look at is they'll say, okay, from the time that your project was awarded in 2020, so they'll look at the 2030 projection numbers. And right now, your numbers look pretty good, actually. A reduction of about 100 students in the pre-K to 6 age group. So it's a little bit of a decline, but not that dramatic, really. Okay, so let's pause and see if there are any questions about the information that we presented thus far.
So one of the questions I have is I saw that you did go to projection and everything else. If we do go to a new school, would that be looking at all the rooms being over 1,000 square feet, was it, or square inches? That way in the future, we've seen a lot of trends where, you know, one year the school is just for preschool, and then all of a sudden it's kindergarten to 5K. That way it looks like we'll be able to have multi-function of these rooms rather than standing out of just one.
So that's a great question. What the state has very specific guidelines that they let us use for square footage.
Yep.
So they will say that if your building is planned for pre-kindergarten through 6th grade, you're allowed to size the classrooms for 1st grade through 6th grade at 800 square feet. There's some adjustments there for various things. Art gets a little bit bigger, music gets a little bit bigger. And the pre-K and kindergarten classrooms are 4,000 square feet. So in order to address the concerns about flexibility of spaces and expansion of spaces, the other thing that the state will ask us to do, and we would work with the community on, is making sure that there's a site that allows for additions to an existing building so that you can expand the new building in the future. So we would make sure that the site isn't completely constrained by a new building, and we are required by the state to show where potential expansion could happen. We also look at providing lots of flexibility in spaces. So we will work with the district to see what kinds of spaces they are using now and what kind of spaces they might think we need in the future. Because it may be that there are some classrooms that are a little bit smaller and some classrooms are a little bit bigger. So that's something that we work with the district on to identify what the programmatic needs are now and what the aspirational needs are in the future. And we work with the state to make sure that the building can accommodate those within reason. The state probably isn't going to have allow all classrooms to be 1,000 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's something that, if we discuss that, if there's if the numbers look like there's going to be 5 pre-K classrooms and 5 kindergarten classrooms, we would work with the district to see what other spaces might need to accommodate something similar to a pre-K or K classroom. So we do try to, the state and us as architects, we work really closely with the district to make sure that we are providing a building for the future.
Mm-hmm.
So, and flexibility is a really big part of that.
Yeah, I was going to say that, at the end of the day, I think the DOE, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, will look at the amount of, the grade configuration, and they'll assign so many square foot per student, okay? So that way it's equitable across the state of Maine. Everybody gets the same share per student, okay? communities can kick in additionals at their own local share whenever they want to. And most of our projects have some component like that. You know, Montera had another 8 classrooms. I know the Caribou project that I worked on, they had a larger gym and a larger music room because they are a larger music program. So that became part of their local share. So if you want to configure it a certain way, that's probably okay. And that's a part of negotiation with DOE in terms of how many square feet they will support per student.
Any other questions?
Dennis, did you still have?
Hi.
Nice presentation. Question 1,
Yes.
is the state still going to allocate their formula for doing this in spite of all of the events that have taken place since December when they gave you permission to do this?
I have not heard otherwise, and every chance I get, I ask Scott Brown, who's the project manager, and they're only funding 3 right now. And 3 is a real small number that's not typical of their cycle. Yeah, but we've got a commitment to go ahead. There are 3 state projects in the queue right now, and we're moving forward. So.
But that was all granted in December before this massive COVID thing happened, right? And now are they even giving a hint that they're going to reduce their participation in this? Because that's one big figure to hand to taxpayers. And,
Sure,
you know what
it
I'm
is.
saying?
I certainly
Being
do.
poor, I have to understand that, you know?
Yep. So they've not said otherwise, and again, I addressed that with Scott Brown, who's the DOE person, recently as 2 weeks ago.
Question 2, have in all of your endeavors to get spaces and heating requirements and all of that, has anything been brought up from the state or from the school district as to maybe having a single school similar to Mount View where they can control all of this from one location instead of trying to advocate 4 different schools?
So that's part of what we're doing in this early exploratory phase, is identifying what makes sense for a grade configuration going forward. Does it make sense to build one building that replaces Fairfield and Clinton and Albion? Does it make sense to build one building that replaces Fairfield, Albion, Clinton, and Benton? And that's something that if what the state has told us is that what the community comes back with in terms of what they think the project should be, the state will support it. They will work to support it. So yes, that is something that we're looking at, to answer your question in the short way.
And do you have any figures on that so far, or are you just...
We don't have figures on that right now. We know that, we could run some square footage calculations based on the current number of students, but if we look at the enrollment of 1,000 students, and if we were to say that, we know what the cost per square foot is that the state would allow for, but we don't know exactly what the project is yet, so we haven't run numbers on it yet.
And question 3, you put up there I'm going to say some kind of graph where you compared our system to the 4 other schools that you did a system check on or something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I got a little concerned over the numbers, like in your electrical, mechanical, and whatever else is up there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wide variance. I mean, it's really striking. But are you looking at the same number of students in each one of those that we accommodate here? Or are there more students in those systems that require that much more?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, because it is hard to compare sort of apples to apples. But what I highlighted down here is Great Falls Elementary School in Gorham. That's 85,000 square feet. That's about the same size as Benton. And I think it has 800 students now. 720. So that's, similar size to Benton, and the energy cost is about 60 cents a square foot, as opposed to the $1.54 that you're paying right now for
That's a
Benton.
big difference.
Mhm.
Really, and that's what made me think about the numbers of students.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't have the students, you don't need the big school. Right?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
The other thing that happens with the size of schools and why it's hard to compare apples to apples, especially with smaller schools, is because when you have, say, a school for 100 students and you have a gym, that square footage for the gym comes onto those 100 students, as opposed to distributing that over like a 600 or 700 student school. Then those numbers start to come down. With the state, they see 600 students as being a sweet spot for efficiencies, and they have a lot of data. But that seems to be where there's a lot of efficiencies, both in the size of the project, the construction, and the attributable net to gross square footage, how much it takes for circulation, but then the core areas, like a gym, like a cafeteria, learning commons, etc. So it's hard to make smaller schools work as a new school. They just become more expensive, and the numbers, they're hard to compare with the other schools.
Thank you. I appreciate
Thank
your
you.
question.
Thanks for your question.
I do have a couple of questions. I think from just being in the community, I grew up 3 houses down from here, so I've been in Benton pretty much my whole life. And I think the community, the parents and the community needs to know what is the goal here? As far as, we've had a lot of talk about, things going on with Albion, going on with Clinton, Benton. I think our goal is a new school, and ultimately looking at the costs of what it would, and believe me, I have friends that live in Albion and friends that live in Clinton, and they're going to be very protective of the elementary schools, and I totally understand that. But I think for what's best ultimately for the children, which is what we're here for, is for the kids, that it needs to be put out there so that, because the gentleman just said, what are we looking at one school? The community has no idea what our ultimate goal is. So we really need to put that out there if that's ultimately what we're looking at doing, is letting the community know so we would have more people sitting here, putting in their input, because we had no idea. I had no idea until I talked to a friend of mine that we're looking at combining everything. And believe me, when you go to Albion, when you go to Clinton, you better be prepared because they're very, very protective of their school, which I understand. But this is ultimately what's best for the kids. And I think that the kids need to have more of what's offered. The teachers need to have more at their disposal to be able to teach our children, which I think a new school will give them. So I really think we need to put more out to the community so you'll get more feedback. So that way when this comes up, you're not going to have a big blow up with people saying, well, I didn't know. I had no idea.
Right.
So,
And I think
that's just my point, is that, believe me, I am 100% behind in the school. My kids are going to be out of Benton in 2 years. They're not going to be with the new school. But, as a taxpayer, like the gentleman brought up, I want to know that our tax dollars are going to what's better for our children and what's better for their education. So, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that that's what we're doing right now, is we're trying to get some information so that we can, and get some feedback like that, so that we can draw a line in the sand and move forward. And that is the goal of the building committee and the school board.
Hello. Okay, I see. I don't mean to do that loud. So I actually am the music teacher here. It's my classroom right over there. And I've worked in all the other buildings. I'm pretty familiar with the layout. And like you mentioned, the issues at Clinton, with that music room at Albion, it's just the stage of their cafeteria, and it's a very awkward setup. So my question is, I know it's still early in the process, but what kind of considerations go into all of the other things outside of a classroom
Yeah.
in this process? So I know in music, having enough space for dance and instruments and art, making sure the sunlight and all that stuff, library, and making sure all of those other things that really round out the school experience for our students. I just would like to know what goes into that process and those considerations.
Yeah, so the state has guidelines for square footage for different space types. So they will say to us, you have X number of students in the building, that means your music classroom is this big. It means that your cafeteria is this big. It means that your learning commons is this big. But we also work with the districts and the staff to identify what you actually need and what your programs actually are. And then we go back to the state and we say, they have a very robust cheering program. They need space for mat storage. They need height so that their cheering kids can actually practice. And for example, there is no guidelines for cheering space in the state. But if you have that program and it's robust and it's important to your community, and we take that back to the state says, yes, clearly you need these spaces, and clearly you need these criteria. So it's a bit of a back and forth. So there are guidelines from the state, but we also work with the staff and the district to identify what the programs are and what the needs are, and then we take that back to the state. One of the key pieces of information that the district generates over the course of the next couple of months is the education specifications, the education vision for the district. What do you want the education to look like in the district? And for pre-K 6. And once we build that, once the district builds that, we help with that, but that's pretty much done for grassroots with the district. That becomes the guiding factor for how we establish programmatic requirements all the way through the project, all the way to finishes in the program. We use that document to help us make those decisions.
Thank you.
If I could add a little something to that. These projects that are funded through the Department of Education, they have all the components to it. Purchase of a piece of property, the new school building, the site work, the furnishings, the playground. They have all of those in there. And on top of that, what we've seen in some of our last schools, because we're really advocates about education and what's coming down the pipeline, hands-on learning, making things with your hands, maker spaces, project runs, innovation lab, working with micro circuitry and robotics. These are all emerging programs that are now coming in as pathways at a very young age. And the Department of Education is listening to that. And we're starting to see some of those spaces come into our facilities, which is great.
So, and that brings up one tight tangential question, I suppose, is in the scheme of this project, if any particular needs become apparent, would it be possible, or is there any ability for there to be some renovations to any existing spaces? For example, if Benton stayed but needed some renovations or some remodeling, and then there's a new building, is that something that can work in this process, or is it typically a one and done type deal?
So potentially, the state has indicated that any essential repairs to Albion, Clinton, or Fairfield, since the applications went in and they were listed they were ranked in the application process, they have told us that any essential repairs to those buildings would be local cost. The state would not fund that.
Okay.
However, if it's determined, for example, that Benton, that there's a new school, a new pre-K 6 school, and Benton becomes something else as part of that process, and some minor renovations need to be done to the interior of Benton in order to make that reorganization of grade levels feasible and possible, that possibly could, it's potentially possible that that could happen.
Okay. Thank you.
And I will add that the DOE team, the school construction team, in their quest for just assessing our capacity district-wide, visited this school, to your point. So they're looking at potentially what could be. And, what we're sorting out right now is primary, Fairfield Primary is number one on the list, they're funding 3, and the others are further down, but the state wants to support us in meeting our need, and whatever that is. And in regard to your other question, that we're going to go through a process to determine ed specifications, and that'll be through the collaboration of faculty, you know, all staff, all programs, parents, other community stakeholders. So you'll build it, they'll design it, and the state will support us as far as what our need was. You know, one of the things, when we looked at that enrollment projection, when we taught pre-K, we do not in this district have universal pre-K. You know, for example, Clinton has a section, and there's a capacity for it, versus kindergarten, whoever shows up, we'll staff it for whatever we need. And that might be one of the fundamental changes here. What does that space look like for little people, you know, versus someone who might be just a half a foot or a foot taller? And it's profound what those spaces look like. So it is all part of what MSAD 49 is a group is going to determine. So
Yeah, I think in my school day, I have a range of 6-year-olds to 12 or 13-year-olds in my class, in my one small classroom. So certainly there's a lot of those types of thoughts that go into things, and that's exactly where I was thinking.
And your question, sir, you know, about square footage for space, and I come into these classrooms, and you know, uniform space, very different when you have bodies of 6th graders in there, and compare that to how 1st graders can use the space. And the state funds us, subsidizes us at a certain ratio for teacher, students, and we have far more students than what that ratio would look like. This place wasn't built for 21 6th graders to be, you know, in a space that big, even though, you know, the enrollment's not that. So there's lots to it.
So at the end of this project is a long-term project, right, to help the community for years to come in costs and in financial for everybody. And the students, of course, is their own priority. So I also agree that, you know, the one structure would make the most sense as far as all of it goes. And every time it's kind of, and there may be more to this, so I'm not sure if this is too early to ask, but the question, I guess, would be, we kind of keep saying, well, we got to go back to the drawing board, and then at some point, we're going to draw a line in the sand, we're going to make a decision, right? So where does that decision come from? Who is involved in that decision? Because everyone's going to give their feedback at each location, maybe the same, it may be different. But someone's got to make a decision in the end based off, you know, what's best for everybody. So I guess that's one of my questions, is where does that decision come from in the end?
You know, I think, Roberta, I'll let you answer that one.
And it's a great question. It's to your point as well. So this is a process for hearing from all the communities, so people have an opportunity for input. But you know, ultimately, it's your school board that's going to decide whether we're going to build a school, whether we're going to consolidate. It is the school board's facility committee that filed these applications in 2012, and we're just working through this process of hearing people. And then there'll be a point at which our building committee will make a recommendation to the board as a body, and they will give us direction on what we're going to pursue, and then we'll look at, you know, what it is, you know, what will those grade ranges be, you know, how many students will this house, so we're getting there.
So to basically go off what he was saying is, this is what I kind of think the question is, you know, the planning is going, do we have an end date that we're looking at? That we are going to start this whole procedure of a new school? I mean, we can plan forever. I planned for 20 years for my first moose hunt, but I didn't have a date. So it's almost useless. You know, we need to finalize something pretty soon. As this gentleman says, the politics change. This could end tomorrow, unless we say this money is already spent.
Well, in regard, the state has not, the state has not given us a figure for what they're going to allocate to the project. That's just not what they're talking right now at all. You know, shortly, once we work through these community forums, the committee will have a recommendation for the school board. But then the work in earnest begins, and it's a lot of planning. This first phase of it, and I don't know if you are going to address like the cycle of, you know, 4 years out from now, maybe if we're lucky, we'll be walking in the building. But doing all the planning work is, you know, what we're in right now for the next several years. And there'll be a public referendum a year from this spring, this June, so June of '22 will be the first phase of that for a public vote of support for moving ahead with the project. So, and there'll be some more information, but it does feel like that. And again, the applications were filed in 2012. So we're just getting there now.
I worked with the superintendent a few years ago, and he always said, you gotta trust the process, you gotta trust the process. But honestly, that's really hard to do, right? When you're sitting here and you don't know what the process is, it's very hard to trust the process. I will say, and I said this in the forums that we did last month, the Department of Education have a very explicit step-by-step process of how you do these projects. And it's tried and true, it's well-tested, it's a well-worn path. We follow those steps to get to the end. But I think that what we're doing, one of the things we're doing right now is we're going to the communities and talking about what we learned and giving everybody the same information so that when we move forward with a decision, people understand how we got there. So, but I hear your frustration, so we're trying to move, we're trying to get the momentum going. And to build on that, you know, we did a couple of community forums last month. It's difficult to get good attendance at those, so we also did an online survey. We got some responses to the online survey. We'll keep that up and maybe add some more surveys, because that was something that we got as feedback, as people they want us to solicit information through surveys, which I think is great. As Roberta mentioned, we're doing 4 more of these community forums where it's community outreach. We're trying to make sure that everybody has the same information. And then we're doing a virtual one at the beginning of next month as well. So what we've heard so far from the forum communities are things like, you know, we like our neighborhood schools, we want to maintain that sense of community and culture going forward. This kind of information is really important for us to get because we know it, right? We know that that's what people like. But when we solicit this information, that all gets baked into the education specifications. And then that informs how the building is designed. We love our small schools. We're concerned about educational equity across the schools. That's something that the building committee has brought up to us as well. The small classrooms at Benton are problematic. The small schools are nice. They're our biggest employer, so that's a concern. And then from the surveys, sorry, the text is terrible, but for the surveys, we've gotten some things like the new building it's a chance to start fresh. It's an opportunity to reimagine delivery of instruction. The most important things are safety and the needs of the staff and the children, creating an energy efficient building, clean, safe, state-of-the-art building. Those kinds of things this is all information that will get considered and baked into the education specifications, these goals and hopes from the community. What do you like about your schools now? Small size, sense of community. That's a recurring theme, right? So that's really important. We want to make sure that whatever the project is going forward, it maintains and supports that sense of community. Fears about the project. People would adhere to traditional beliefs around schooling, and the communities will hold on to sort of outdated classroom building design. Concerns about railroading the project through without consideration about the consequences of closing schools. So that's something we want to make sure we're addressing. That the school won't have a big focus on nature and natural surroundings. Wants us to think outside the box. This is good, right? These are all really good comments. So some of the issues that we know the building committee is looking at and that the school board is looking at are things like making sure that if we have community feedback, the community feedback is getting incorporated into the process and into the project, because all of that supports a successful referendum in a year and a half. We want to make sure that all the work we're doing now gets us to a successful referendum. Universal pre-K, educational equity across the district, and the educational vision of the district. So this is the process, step-by-step process I was mentioning. You're about here, where this is, and this is the step for referendum. So there's lots of little steps in between that we take with the building, the Department of Education. There's things like the educational specifications, site selection is going to be a big one, right? That's going to be that's going to be the next big hurdle. Once we get past the hurdle of what is the project, it's going to be where is the project. And then lots of other little things like we have lots of meetings with different stakeholders. We need to meet with the fire marshal, we need to meet with the local authorities, we meet with the Department of Education, we meet with on a regular basis.
We've got a whole program plan, meeting with the teachers, meeting with all the staff, meeting with all the staff, everything. And then I think in the big scheme of things, the Department of Education wants projects that have community support and have done their homework. So for us right now, it's really listening, getting feedback, shaping the project, and then communicating with the DOE on the next steps. So.
And if I could just add that previous slide right there, and you're trying to see, it's on our website, and just right on the main page, there's a tab, school construction.
Okay.
And there's a lot of detail in there that spans probably about 5 years. So
this one starts construction right here, step 20. This starts construction. And all of these, like, in each of these big orange steps is where we go to the State Board of Education because they get involved in the approval process as well. There are lots of stakeholders involved. So we talked a little bit about what is the project. The next step is going to be, what are the educational aspirations? That's the educational specifications we talked about. You want to talk a little bit about what is the project?
Well, I think where we're at right now is we're listening to each community, and we need to hear from everyone what they think about what is before them, this opportunity with the Department of Education, and how they feel about restructuring, reorganizing, combining possibly, not combining. We need to know what the pulse is that everybody is really focused on so that we can record that and make it a basis for going forward. We know everybody's not going to be in the same camp. We know that. Okay, we've done a lot of these projects, but especially with multiple communities, folks like their local schools. But at the same time, we have to weigh the pros and cons. Educational equity, giving the same opportunities to staff and kids alike, creating value for the taxpayers, more efficient buildings, and something that's going to carry down the road. So we really have to hear from you, like, gee, I think it should look like this. I think it should be this. I think it should be a combined project, and I know that initiative has been out there in your community. So here we are. The good news is you've got funding with the DOE. Now we've got to really show some support and define what that project is so that everybody can get on board. What we're going for now is referendum. We want everybody to know about the project. We don't want anybody showing up and saying, I've never heard about the project. Now's the time to listen and get involved and give us some feedback.
Is there anything else anybody wants to comment on at this point? Okay. So like I said, the next step is the educational specifications. Once we know what the project is it a new pre-K school that just replaces Fairfield, or is it a pre-K 6 school? Then we can design the education specifications for it. The next big question that I mentioned is where is the project? So I wanted to just talk a little briefly about what that process looks like, because I know that's kind of, in a lot of people's minds, that's the next big hurdle. So when we do what the state calls site selection, it's a fairly in-depth process. And I'll take you through what we did just recently up in Caribou. In Caribou, they identified 6 sites in their community that were potential sites for a new pre-K-8 school. Then they created a list of criteria. Some of those criteria items are from the state guidelines. Some were their own guidelines. Some were from their own needs, their own ideas of what the site should offer. So they had things like geographic location within a designated growth area comprehensive plan. That was something that they wanted to make sure it complied with. Parcel size and shape, that's something that comes from the state. The state has guidelines about how big the parcel should be. Proximity to residential neighborhoods was important to them. Zoning and planning compliance, abutting property capability, usable land percentage, that's another thing that comes from the state. So they had all these criteria, and then they rated each one of those criteria for each of the sites that they looked at. So they basically scored each of the 6 sites. They gave each one of these criteria a number of 1 to 10, 1 through 20, depending on what the range was, and then they scored each of the sites. Then they had 3 top contenders, and we went through with them the pros and cons for each of the 3 contenders. Pros being, this one was an in-town site, this one was more flexible and in a residential neighborhood. We only had to demolish 1 building for this site, but we had to demolish 3 for this site. This one allowed for a campus-style setup where their high school would be on the same campus as their pre-K-8. And then they had cons associated with each one. For each of those 3 sites, we then do a test fit to see how a building might lay out on that site and what would the site circulation look like and how would the playgrounds work. And we look at each of them, each of the 3 sites, and identify what the capacity was of the site. Is it a funny shape? Is there a tree line that people would like to maintain? Are there buffers that you want to maintain between other neighbors? And how could a whole project lay out on the site? Ultimately, they ended up with this site because it had proximity to other amenities for them. That was something that was really important to them.
I was going to say, it really came down to community use of Caribou and how they could consolidate. From the facilities director said, I want 1 switch, I want 1 boiler, and I want multiple boilers. That's where he was coming from. But in the end of it, they had so many other buildings around, wellness center, a recreation center, that it became sort of an association, okay? A really nice adjacency that the students could go over to the recreation center, go over to the wellness center, and it's right downtown with services. So it's kind of like one-stop shopping.
But I think, when we get to that point where we've got potential sites and we're evaluating them, we're also evaluating them on sort of empirical data. Does it have utilities already? Are utilities available to that site? What does the busing look like to that site from all the different communities? What does if that's required, right? What's the access to the site? What is the infrastructure costs associated with that site? So there is empirical data that we look at to evaluate the different sites, including its location in the community, that help the committee determine exactly which site is the most appropriate site. And that's where that scoring diagram is really useful, because you can have sort of an emotional reaction to a site, but if you score it so that you can actually look at the different criteria that you've established as being important. That allows you to really look with somewhat fresh eyes on different sites and whether they meet those criteria or not.
So in terms of site selection and size and capacity for a new elementary school, I think it's 20 acres plus 1 additional acre for every 100 students, I think, something like that. So say you want a 600 student school, 20 acres plus another 6, so you get 26 acre site you're looking for. That's almost double the size of Denton, okay, which would allow for expansion going into the future. So those are, that's a real good thing. The other thing is on the schedule there, you saw those orange arrows that kind of went on, it would be required to do a straw poll. Public hearing, it's sort of informal straw poll, but the Department of Education requires that, just like they do for concept design, presenting the budgets, everything else, and they're going to do that on the site plan too. So it's a very transparent process. Everybody knows what's going on and the criteria.
So I got a question about, I guess, more or less your opinions, right? So you've done this many times, you evaluated all the schools, and what I'm gathering, or when you're just talking about hearing it, is that it makes sense to go to one place, right? Because it's more feasible, 4 boilers you just mentioned, you're shrinking it all down, more cost efficient, everybody kind of shares the taxes at the end of the day, and it's more effective in that manner. And I don't know if you guys are allowed to put that kind of input or not, but what makes the most sense based off your evaluation so far?
Yeah, so we have made a recommendation to the board that Fairfield, Albion, and Clinton we don't recommend they be used, continued use for education without significant local investment into the buildings. So those are the $4 to $5 million we were talking about, right? We suspect that that's probably not feasible, right? The $5 million into those 2 buildings, or those 3 buildings each, that's a lot to ask of the community. And the state would not support that. So that's been our recommendation to date. We think that Benton, as Al mentioned, Benton has continued life in it. We think that, it's 30 years old, but these buildings are typically built for 50 plus years. So we think that Benton actually has continued life in it. The systems are in good shape. The building itself has good design. It's a very sound building. But the other 3, we don't recommend continued use for education. The other thing that we look at, we went through a lot of the stuff about accessibility and the systems, et cetera, but we also look at educational suitability. And one of the challenges that those buildings have is they don't have the right spaces for the programs that you want to be able to offer currently. So they don't have the right spaces for special education. They don't have the right spaces for, just having cafeteria and gymnasiums, right, separated in some cases. So they're academically, it's difficult to justify that they're suitable for the future of education. That's not to say they're not useful buildings for communities, right? They could have community life left to come.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. That's, just from a systems standpoint, a code standpoint, looking at those, and the workarounds and carrying that down the road, even if you replace some of the major systems, you're still working with an envelope with limited insulation. You're not going to improve that unless you re-insulate or reclad it or put on a new roof. So you can only take that so far. And then there's the whole air conditioning, heating situation. You asked about flexibility. What's going to happen with these buildings? You need to have use during the summertime and now in the shoulder portions of the year. I bet you Fairfield gets pretty toasty.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
With that kind of a system, with one switch, and we're just blowing it out the windows. That's the kind of thing that I think can create real value for the taxpayers when you really look at it like that. So that's what we try to do. We try to gather all those things together. So I'm looking at these 3 schools and I'm saying, gee, if I had this opportunity, I'd kind of look at a way to leverage as much as that as I can going down the road, because you're gonna see some return on that just on the operations and the utility side. Plus, you have a healthier school for the kids, a safer school for the kids in the community. Lots of things coming.
Just even with this pandemic right now and what we're seated in here, and we do have some federal monies to upgrade ventilation. We were looking at quotes for the Lawrence complex, this building, but there's nothing to even retrofit in the others. And that's a serious concern. Not that we're going to be in this forever, but ventilation is important.
And that brought up a point that I was going to bring up as far as, none of us want to see us go through this again. Nobody wants that. But being a medical person that I am, that needs to be a consideration too, because they need to be able, if we need to, God forbid, space these kids out again, they need to be in school, and the teachers need to be safe, and the kids need to be safe. And in Benton right now, with the school, the classrooms the size they are, you can't do that safely. And so, it almost makes this building, and like I said, I don't want to be morbid and think negative thoughts, but look at what we're going through right now. So, and I think that needs to be a consideration too, as far as making it so if we have to do something like this again, God forbid, we're not having our kids not get the education that they need.
And newer schools are in a better position to deal with this right now. They have systems that allow them to flush the building out every night. They can run their air exchange system overnight every night and clean out the whole building over the course of the evening, and then start fresh the next day. So there's that whole, for a while, gosh, we didn't know what we were getting into, right? So in September, we had all these plans about 2 days on, clean all the buildings on Wednesday, and then, let the buildings sit, and then have 2 days again. We didn't know what we were doing, right? We didn't know what the protocol should have been. But now we know that air exchange is important, and if you can get good air exchange in the buildings, we have new buildings now that they're able to run their systems at a higher air exchange than they were designed to run at normally, because the system is designed to do that. You can allow that to happen, and it just helps keep the fresh air coming in the building, and it makes it cleaner, it makes it a better space.
So this is a little bit of a follow-up to the last question, and in addition to that as well, is you mentioned, say it was the 3 schools, Clinton, Albion, and Fairfield, right? And this still has some life in it and things like that. So the funding, and I may be way off on this, but the funding is for one structure, correct? So say it was to build one school, covered those 3 schools, right? And in the presentation, you guys expressed that although this place is much further along than the others and has a lot less issues, there's still a significant amount of money that would probably need to be put into this. So I guess the question is, where does that money come from? I'm assuming that it comes from taxpayers.
Yeah, so the state probably won't look to upgrade this building. They won't, it's unlikely that they will fund upgrading this building. However, they do want us to look at what role Benton plays in the district as a school building. So if this building gets reloaded with different age groups and it maybe needs some changes associated with that, then that would be something that we could present to the state and work with them on. But the state probably won't pay for a sprinkler system in this building just to have a sprinkler system in this building as part of this project. There are other avenues to get funding from the state for things like sprinkler systems, ADA upgrades. They run a revolving renovation fund every few years that you can apply for and get funding from the state to support that in a similar fashion. It's bonded money. So there are other venues, there are other ways to get state funding outside of this project that could make some upgrades to this building. But it's unlikely that those kind of upgrades would be part of this project.
I think you're talking about the state revolving renovation funds.
Yeah.
Yes, and just like the DOE funding for major capital improvement projects, we don't really know when that time is, but you should keep your eyes open, and you should be prepared to put in, for let's say, ADA, okay? That they would help support that, ADA, and asbestos, and a lot of things that Kathy referred to as the life safety tier 1 kind of elements. You know, when you look at the numbers, when you look at the numbers in terms of energy and maintenance, Benton is a little bit higher than that was. And, you know, I said, geez, that's a newer building, how can that be? Well, yes, it's a newer building, therefore it has more of the systems. It has ventilation, it has mechanical ventilation. The other schools don't. And mechanical ventilation, if you look at the overall energy profile in these facilities, ventilation takes up 30 to 40% of that total pie. So all of a sudden, when you have the two schools, if you were to take 30 to 40% of that number and add it to those numbers, that might be start to approach what's happening, you know, what those numbers are here and then. But now, you know, that is what, 30 years old now? We've got so many more new systems, approaches to our envelopes, all kinds of things that really increase the efficiency and things we can look at on our own side. The other thing, I'm just going to throw in a comment about COVID and the pandemic. Now's the perfect time to do a school, right? What if we had done it before COVID? Right? We wouldn't have that into consideration. Now we know. We know this is before us, and it's going to be a focus factor. It's just like furnishings. All of our furnishings we selected were for collaboration and moving kids together. And what happened when the pandemic came along, all of a sudden we're trying to figure out how to pull them apart, how to put the wires, how to have them out in the hallways, how to make it a touchless environment. So those are all things that are going to start to come into our planning process.
So looking ahead, I know it's ahead of your graph and everything else, how much space do you think with what you guys propose with replacing the 3 schools, how much space do you think it would take for that? You said, you know, 20 acres plus every 100 students.
That's my calculator.
Can you do some math?
Yeah.
Hold on.
I mean, my head, I'm looking almost 30 acres.
Let's do a one.
Well,
Yeah.
We
so
can do a one.
it's about 26
Yeah.
acres roughly. Somewhere between 20 and 26 acres for land. And then for square footage, I was going to do the square footage calculations right now. Because the state will, like he said earlier.
We're in a school, so I'm putting you on the spot.
So Kathy had thrown down a what of 85,000. We took 600 kids. And 148 was the mixed age group. We're talking about 88,800 square feet.
Okay.
Okay? So
What
that's-
if scenario?
Yeah, it's what if.
that's about the same size as that?
It's about 5,000 square feet bigger than that. That's 83.
Okay.
Yep.
That gives you some relative size of what we I mean, that's for 600 students, so.
So, and if I could just add, you know, square footage wise and what that looks like, and we noticed when we went into some of the newer buildings, the selection committee did, is that, you know, say bathrooms, as it relates to even distancing in restrooms, new construction, they're single-use spaces, and you think about how much real estate that takes. Or pre-K, you have little 4-year-olds in the building, and you probably don't want them crossing paths with 5th and 6th graders. I mean, there are wings dedicated, so you're using your space to kind of segregate out and build little communities within the school, much like Benton has here. And again, back to the efficiency, these air purifiers for our buildings right now that don't have a system in, that, you know, we're going to be putting those in classrooms coming up. We've got, you know, federal money to deal with ventilation, but plugging those in all those spaces is not the most efficient approach to it, but it's something that, you know, we need to do right now, short term.
Right.
But,
All right, that's all we had. I really appreciate all your feedback. You guys asked really good questions.
we're going to capture those and put an FAQ up on that site, on that tab. And it's a little sparse right now because we're just, like you said, we're just getting going, but everything will be there. And you can also look at the Department of Ed, and maybe I'll add this document. There's this, we've been talking about ed specifications, right? A whole process about what we need and, you know, what we want and what that's gonna look like as far as the design. And that's a DOE mandated process, so I'll put that up there too, so you can see it.
Is this slideshow gonna be up there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And these recordings, all these sessions, will have links. The other two are already up there. We'll take from the virtual, we're gonna run a chat. We won't be able to manage the calls, but we're putting out there everything so people at least have an opportunity to understand it, know what to contribute. And there'll be more of this along the way, because like you said, we're not near about what it's gonna look like. We'll need a lot of input for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, your question, yes.
Has the DOE changed their specifications since the pandemic?
They have not, in writing.
Will you be looking to do larger size square footage than what they would allow for a child or classroom?
Yeah, so I actually have not had a specific conversation about that, post-pandemic, post-COVID conversation about that. I have talked to them about wanting to hopefully make more strides in sustainable building, because their guidelines for sustainability are quite dated. So their written guidelines for sustainability are quite dated, but they are putting more and more things kind of into their projects as they can. So I haven't had a specific conversation with them about that, but I can do that. I can make a specific call to talk about that, because I think that's a good question that we should have an answer to.
In your experience, I'm sure it's different for every building, have they been receptive to changes that community would like to make above their specifications? Like, say you did want to do larger class sizes, I mean, education is a very dynamic environment. If you did want to do that, have they been receptive, or would that come at taxpayers' cost?
So typically that does come at taxpayers' cost. The additional square footage typically comes at the taxpayers' cost. What they are open to is things like if you have a very strong program for special ed that needs specific spaces, and you have a lot of programs that support those spaces, they will look at more space to support programs that you already have, right? Specifically in special ed, or in, we did a project recently where they had this really great sort of alternative ed program for their students that required square footage, and since it was an integral part of their community and an integral part of their program at their school, that was something that the state supported. So it wasn't in their guidelines, it wasn't one of the square footages that they allocated in the guidelines, but it was something that was really important to that community, and it was an existing program that they would support. But typically the additional space for classrooms is not something that they support with their dollars.
But they may in other areas, depending on what community is
Yeah,
necessary.
yeah, they'll support their programs.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'm going to throw in a little something. It has changed our attitude as designers, because when we now look at our plans of the schools, we look at every space as being a classroom space, so to speak. Even if we have a little extra space in the hallway in the corridor, we're going to put up a screen, we're going to put in power, we're going to allow for these spaces, the stage, the platform, have another class there in the cafeteria, but you need certain things to make that happen. But that's sort of changed our thinking about continuing to make the learning environment ubiquitous every year, so as much as we can. Super duper, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
everybody.
Thank you very much.